The sound of rotor blades cutting through the evening air silenced 300 guests in an instant. Sarah Chen stood frozen on the country club's marble terrace, champagne flute trembling in her hand, as the unmistakable green and white helicopter descended toward the manicured golf course. Marine One, the president's helicopter, landing at her 20-year class reunion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her mother, Patricia, grabbed her pearl necklace with white knuckles. Her sister, Amanda, dropped her phone mid-sentence, the screen clattering against the stone floor. Every face in the crowd turned from the helicopter to Sarah, then back again, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. "No way," someone whispered from the crowd. "There's no way she's important enough for that." But the helicopter kept descending, its powerful rotors whipping tablecloths and sending centerpieces flying across the country club's pristine lawn. And Sarah Chen, the girl they'd spent the entire evening mocking, stood perfectly still, watching 20 years of humiliation finally come full circle. The Riverside Country Club had always been the crown jewel of their small Ohio town, a place where old money met new pretensions, and everyone pretended their secrets weren't hanging out in broad daylight. Sarah had walked through its mahogany doors 3 hours earlier, wearing a simple navy dress she'd picked up from a department store in Washington, her hair pulled back in a practical bun that screamed government employee rather than glamorous alumni. She hadn't wanted to come. The invitation had sat on her kitchen counter for 2 months, moving from pile to pile as she debated whether facing her past was worth the inevitable disappointment. But something about turning 38, about reaching the point where excuses stop working and avoidance becomes its own prison, had finally pushed her to book the flight from D.C. to Columbus. The reunion committee had done their usual job of transforming the ballroom into a shrine to their graduating class of 2005. Blown-up yearbook photos lined the walls. A slideshow of then and now pictures rotated endlessly on screens throughout the room, and a DJ who clearly hadn't updated his playlist since senior prom played the same songs that had soundtracked their teenage years. Sarah had signed in at the registration table, receiving a name tag with her senior photo that made her cringe. 18-year-old Sarah stared back at her with hopeful eyes and an unfortunate haircut, completely unaware of the battles waiting ahead. Jessica Martinez, who'd organized every class event since graduation, had squealed with manufactured enthusiasm. "Sarah Chen! Oh my gosh, I wasn't sure you'd make it. We heard you were in Washington doing something with the government?" The question hung in the air like Jessica was fishing for details she could later dissect with the other organizers. "Something like that," Sarah had replied, accepting her name tag and scanning the room for familiar faces. Most of her classmates had clustered into the same groups they'd formed 2 decades earlier. The athletes stood near the bar, their varsity jackets replaced by polo shirts that couldn't quite hide the evidence of desk jobs and weekend golf games. The theater kids had claimed a corner table, still dramatic, still loud, still trying to prove they were the most interesting people in any room. Her family had arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that ensured everyone would notice their presence. Patricia Chen swept into the ballroom wearing a burgundy cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Her silver hair styled in perfect waves that hadn't moved despite the October wind outside. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years building a restaurant empire from a single takeout counter, who'd clawed her way into Riverside's social elite through sheer determination and strategic charity donations. Amanda followed behind, all sharp angles and sharper ambition, her black designer dress complementing the confidence that came from making partner at Cleveland's most prestigious law firm before her 35th birthday. Her husband Brad trailed in their wake, handsome in the bland way that suggested excellent breeding and even better stock options. Sarah had watched them work the room like seasoned politicians, embracing old friends and acquaintances with practiced smiles and carefully modulated enthusiasm. Patricia's laugh, bright and musical, carried across the ballroom as she regaled a group of former PTA mothers with stories about Amanda's latest legal victories and the expansion of Chen's Golden Dragon restaurant chain throughout the Midwest. "And Sarah's doing so well too," Patricia had said when someone inevitably asked about her younger daughter. "She's in Washington, you know. Government work. very hush-hush. She'd waved her hand dismissively, as if Sarah's career was simultaneously important enough to mention and mundane enough to gloss over in the same breath. Sarah had spent most of the cocktail hour floating between conversations, smiling politely as former classmates updated her on their lives. Marriages, divorces, kids, career changes, the usual catalog of how 20 years can reshape a person's existence. She'd fielded the standard questions about her own life with practiced evasion, describing her work in the vaguest possible terms, and deflecting inquiries about her personal life with self-deprecating humor. Still single, still married to the job, she'd said more times than she could count, watching as people's expressions shifted from curiosity to pity, to the kind of awkward concern reserved for women who'd apparently failed to check the appropriate life milestone boxes. The real trouble had started during dinner, when Patricia had chosen their table's conversation topics with the surgical precision of someone who'd spent decades learning how to cut people down without appearing to draw blood. She'd dominated the discussion with stories about Amanda's courtroom victories, her charitable work with the Junior League, and her recent feature in Cleveland Magazine's Women to Watch issue. "Of course, we're just so proud of both our girls," Patricia had said, reaching across the table to squeeze Amanda's hand. "Amanda's partnership was announced in all the legal journals, and Sarah's doing important work too, aren't you, dear? Even if we can't always understand exactly what it is." The words had landed with the weight of a carefully aimed stone, drawing uncomfortable chuckles from the other table guests. Sarah had felt the familiar heat creep up her neck, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times growing up when Patricia would praise Amanda's achievements, while simultaneously undermining her own with faint damns and backhanded compliments. Amanda had smiled that particular smile Sarah remembered from childhood, the one that suggested she was enjoying the show while maintaining plausible deniability about participating in it. "Sarah's always been the mysterious one," she'd added with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We never know if she's saving the world or just filing paperwork in some basement office." The table had erupted in polite laughter, the kind that suggested everyone understood the subtext even if they weren't brave enough to acknowledge it directly. Sarah had excused herself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect herself before the evening progressed any further. Standing in the country club's elegant powder room, surrounded by gold fixtures and oil paintings of hunting scenes, she'd stared at her reflection and wondered why she thought coming home would be any different this time. 20 years of distance, of building a life that mattered, of earning respect from some of the most powerful people in the country, and she was still that awkward teenager who never quite fit into her family's carefully constructed image of success. She'd returned to find the conversation had moved on to Amanda's recent vacation to the French Riviera, complete with phone photos of designer boutiques and five-star restaurants. Patricia had held court, describing each detail with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally achieved the lifestyle she'd always believed her family deserved. "You should plan a trip like that, Sarah," Amanda had suggested with mock sincerity. "I'm sure the government gives you plenty of vacation time. Though I suppose you'd need to check with your security clearance people first, right?" The comment had drawn more laughs from their table mates, people who'd once been Sarah's classmates and who should have understood that success came in many forms. Instead, they joined in the gentle mockery, treating her career like an amusing curiosity rather than a serious profession. When the DJ had announced the beginning of the reunion's traditional slideshow, featuring photos submitted by classmates showcasing their post-graduation lives, Sarah had felt her stomach clench. She'd submitted a single professional headshot from her government directory, knowing that anything more would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer in a public forum. The slideshow had been exactly what she'd expected. Glossy family portraits, vacation photos from exotic locations, pictures of successful businesses and beautiful homes. When her photo had appeared on screen, a simple image of her in a navy blazer against a neutral background, the silence from her table had been deafening. "Very professional," Patricia had murmured, her tone suggesting that professionalism was somehow a character flaw rather than an asset. It was then, as Sarah sat surrounded by her family's disappointment and her classmates' barely concealed pity, that she'd heard the first distant rumble of helicopter blades cutting through the evening air. The sound had grown steadily louder, drowning out the DJ's music and causing conversations throughout the ballroom to gradually fade into confused silence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the country club's championship golf course, Sarah had been the first to spot the approaching aircraft. Marine One, unmistakable in its distinctive livery, had been descending toward the manicured fairway like something from a movie. And in that moment, standing on the terrace with 300 pairs of eyes moving between her and the presidential helicopter, Sarah Chen had realized that 20 years of being underestimated by her own family was about to come to a very public end. The chaos that followed Marine One's landing would be talked about in Riverside for decades to come. 300 reunion guests pressed against the ballroom's windows like children at a zoo, their phones appearing in unison to capture whatever impossibility was unfolding on the country club's 18th green. The helicopter's rotors continued spinning, creating a wind tunnel that sent napkins and programs swirling across the terrace in tiny tornadoes. Sarah remained motionless near the railing, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand as she watched the aircraft's doors slide open. 2 Secret Service agents emerged first, their black suits and earpieces immediately recognizable even from a distance. They surveyed the area with the methodical precision of professionals who'd done this exact routine countless times before, their eyes scanning for threats that everyone else was too stunned to even consider. Behind her, conversations erupted in fragments of disbelief and speculation. Someone shouted that it had to be a mistake, that helicopters didn't just land at class reunions in small Ohio towns. Another voice suggested it might be some elaborate prank, though the serious demeanor of the Secret Service agents made that theory seem increasingly unlikely. Patricia Chen stood frozen beside the dessert table, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, denial, and something that might have been the early stages of panic. She'd spent the entire evening controlling every narrative, steering every conversation, ensuring that her version of the Chen family story remained the only one worth telling. The arrival of a presidential helicopter had introduced a variable she couldn't manage or explain. Amanda had moved closer to the windows, her legal mind clearly working to process the implications of what she was witnessing. Brad stood beside her, his phone recording everything, while he provided running commentary to his social media followers about the unprecedented scene unfolding at his wife's high school reunion. "There's no way this is real," Amanda muttered, her voice tight with the kind of controlled frustration that suggested her carefully organized worldview was experiencing a significant malfunction. Sarah works for some boring government department. She probably processes immigration paperwork or files reports about agricultural subsidies. The crowd's speculation grew louder as more figures emerged from the helicopter. A military aide carrying a briefcase, another Secret Service agent, and finally a woman in a Navy suit who moved with the kind of purposeful confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. Jessica Martinez had abandoned her post at the registration table and was now pushing through the crowd towards Sarah, her reunion organizer badge giving her the false confidence to believe she had some authority over whatever was happening. "Sarah, do you know what's going on? Did you call someone? Is this some kind of security threat?" Sarah turned to face Jessica, noting how the woman's excited curiosity was tinged with the kind of fear that came from realizing she might be responsible for explaining to 300 alumni why their reunion had been interrupted by what appeared to be a federal incident. "I think you should probably keep everyone inside for now," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that Jessica had never heard from the quiet girl who'd sat in the back of their AP history class. The suggestion was delivered as casual advice, but something in Sarah's tone made Jessica nod immediately and begin herding people away from the windows. 20 years of government service had taught Sarah how to project calm authority in chaotic situations, a skill that proved surprisingly effective even at high school reunions. On the golf course, the woman in the Navy suit was walking directly toward the country club, flanked by her security detail and moving with the kind of purpose that suggested this wasn't a social call. She carried herself like someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of people, her stride confident, despite the uneven terrain of the fairway. Kevin Park, who'd been Sarah's lab partner in senior chemistry and had spent most of the evening trying to reconnect with old friends, appeared beside her at the railing. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happening, but I have to ask, do you know why the president's helicopter just landed at our reunion?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized that this was the moment when everything changed. 20 years of careful privacy, of deflecting questions and avoiding specifics about her work, was about to end whether she was ready or not. The woman approaching from the helicopter would make any further evasion impossible. "Kevin," she said, turning to face her former classmate with a small smile, "I think you're about to find out exactly what I do for a living." Behind them, the crowd had grown restless, despite Jessica's attempts to maintain order. Patricia had finally found her voice, and was demanding answers from anyone within earshot, her social anxiety manifesting as indignation that someone else was controlling the evening's agenda. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Patricia announced to a group of former PTA members who'd gathered around her like courtiers seeking guidance from their queen. "Someone needs to call the authorities. You can't just land helicopters on private property without permission. The country club's insurance probably doesn't cover this kind of disruption." Her complaints were met with nervous laughter from women who'd spent decades following Patricia's lead in matters of social protocol, but found themselves in uncharted territory when it came to presidential aircraft etiquette. The situation was so far outside their collective experience that their usual deference to Patricia's judgment seemed inadequate. Amanda had positioned herself near the terrace doors, clearly torn between her desire to understand what was happening and her instinct to distance herself from whatever federal complication her sister might have brought to their reunion. Her legal training had taught her to be cautious around situations involving government officials and helicopters, but her curiosity was warring with her professional paranoia. The woman from the helicopter had reached the edge of the golf course and was now walking across the country club's carefully maintained gardens toward the main building. Her security detail maintained their positions around her, their eyes constantly scanning the building's windows and the small crowd that had gathered on the terrace. As she drew closer, Sarah could see that the woman was younger than she'd initially appeared, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of controlled composure that came from years of high-stakes government service. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with the efficiency of someone who'd interrupted her evening for a matter of significant importance. The reunion guests had largely abandoned any pretense of normal social interaction and were now openly gawking at the approaching entourage. Phones were recording from every angle, and Sarah knew that within hours, footage of Marine One landing at the Riverside High School class of 2005 reunion would be trending on every social media platform. Tom Richardson, who'd been the class president and had spent most of the evening holding court near the bar, approached Sarah with the kind of swagger that suggested he believed his high school leadership credentials gave him some authority over the current situation. "Sarah, I think as class president I should probably handle whatever official business this is," he announced, straightening his tie and affecting the kind of serious expression he probably used during homeowners association meetings. "I mean, if there's some kind of federal issue, they should really be dealing with elected representatives." Sarah looked at Tom with the same patient expression she used during National Security Council meetings, when junior staffers overestimated their importance. "Tom, I appreciate the offer, but I think they're here specifically for me." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the nearby guests who'd been eavesdropping on their conversation. Sarah Chen, the quiet girl who'd never been elected to student council or chosen for homecoming court, was claiming that the president's helicopter had landed specifically to collect her from their high school reunion. Linda Hartwell, Patricia's closest friend and longtime co-conspirator in Riverside's social hierarchy, had joined the growing group of onlookers surrounding Sarah. Her expression suggested she was personally offended by the suggestion that Sarah might be important enough to warrant a presidential helicopter. "Honey, I think you might be confused," Linda said with the kind of condescending sweetness she'd perfected during 40 years of PTA politics. "Federal agents don't just show up for mid-level government employees. This is probably some kind of mistake or security exercise." Sarah turned to face Linda with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. 20 years of dealing with foreign diplomats and hostile congressional committees had taught her how to handle people who underestimated her capabilities, and Linda Hartwell was proving to be remarkably similar to a certain type of entitled politician she'd encountered throughout her career. "You might be right," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough ambiguity to leave room for doubt. "I guess we'll find out in a few minutes." The woman from the helicopter had reached the terrace stairs and was now climbing toward the main gathering area where Sarah stood surrounded by her increasingly bewildered classmates. Her security detail had spread out to create a perimeter that subtly but firmly discouraged the crowd from getting too close to their principal. As she reached the top of the stairs, the woman's eyes immediately found Sarah in the crowd, confirming what everyone had begun to suspect, but few were willing to believe. She approached with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested this wasn't a social call, but also wasn't an emergency. "Ms. Chen," the woman said, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet terrace, "I apologize for interrupting your evening, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." The formal tone and public acknowledgement sent a wave of stunned silence through the reunion guests. Sarah Chen, who'd spent the entire evening being subtly mocked by her own family for her mysterious government job, was apparently important enough that federal officials would track her down at a high school reunion and extract her via presidential helicopter. Patricia's face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against skin that had lost all its color. Amanda stood with her mouth slightly open, her lawyer's composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that contradicted everything she'd believed about her sister's career. Sarah nodded to the woman, recognizing the code phrases and professional courtesy that indicated this was indeed official business of the highest priority. "Of course," she replied, her own voice shifting into the formal register she used during crisis briefings. "Do I have time to collect my things?" "We can arrange for your personal effects to be delivered," the woman replied, then added with a slight smile, "though I understand this timing is particularly inconvenient." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, taking in 20 years of assumptions and dismissals, of family dinners where her achievements were glossed over, and reunions where her career was treated as an amusing mystery. Tomorrow, everyone in Riverside would know exactly what Sarah Chen did for a living. But tonight, she was still just the quiet girl who'd somehow managed to summon a presidential helicopter to her high school reunion. "Actually," she said, reaching into her purse to retrieve her phone and car keys, "I think the timing might be perfect." The walk across the country club's terrace felt like a scene from someone else's life. Sarah moved through the crowd of her former classmates, each step accompanied by whispered conversations and the soft clicking of phone cameras, capturing what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about moment in Riverside High School history. The woman from the helicopter maintained a respectful distance beside her, neither rushing nor dawdling, simply matching Sarah's pace with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to escorting important people through complicated situations. Patricia had finally found her voice again, though it emerged as a strangled whisper that somehow carried across the stunned silence of the terrace. "Sarah, what is happening? What aren't you telling us?" The questions came out sharp and demanding, tinged with the kind of maternal authority that expected immediate answers regardless of the circumstances. Sarah paused in her movement toward the helicopter, turning to face her mother with an expression that combined 20 years of accumulated patience with a newfound sense of liberation. The moment felt suspended in time, like the split second between lightning and thunder when the world holds its breath waiting for the inevitable impact. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice carrying with crystalline clarity across the silent terrace, "I'm the Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. I've been in that position for 3 years, and before that, I spent 17 years working my way up through the intelligence community, the State Department, and the National Security Council." The words landed like physical blows among the gathered crowd. Amanda's face cycled through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been the early stages of panic, as the implications of her sister's revelation began to sink in. Brad stopped recording his social media story mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as he realized he'd been documenting what was essentially a national security event. Linda Hartwell took a step backward, her face flushing red as she processed the fact that she'd just condescendingly lectured one of the highest-ranking national security officials in the country about the importance of federal agents. Her husband grabbed her arm, probably calculating how many times over the years they'd dismissed or patronized the woman who apparently had direct access to the president's ear. Jessica Martinez stood frozen near the ballroom doors, her reunion organizer badge suddenly feeling absurdly inadequate as she realized her event had just been commandeered by what appeared to be a matter of national importance. The liability implications alone were enough to make her head spin, Never mind the fact that she was going to have to explain to 300 alumni why their evening had been interrupted by presidential aircraft. Tom Richardson had gone completely silent, his earlier offer to handle the federal officials now seeming laughably presumptuous. His wife stood beside him, frantically scrolling through her phone, probably trying to find some trace of Sarah's career that they'd somehow missed over the past 2 decades of casual social media stalking. The woman from the helicopter had been watching the family dynamics with the kind of professional interest that suggested she'd seen similar scenes before. High-level government officials often came from families who had no idea about the true scope of their loved ones' responsibilities, and the revelation process rarely went smoothly. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Sarah with the formal courtesy reserved for senior officials, "the situation involves the developing crisis in Eastern Europe. The President is convening an emergency session of the National Security Council, and your presence is required for strategic assessment and policy recommendations." The mention of Eastern Europe and emergency sessions sent another wave of stunned silence through the crowd. These weren't the kind of vague government responsibilities that could be dismissed or minimized. This was the real thing, the kind of high-stakes international crisis that dominated newspaper headlines and shaped global politics. Kevin Park, who'd been standing near Sarah throughout the revelation, found his voice first. "Eastern Europe? Sarah, are you telling us you're involved in whatever's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now?" Sarah looked at Kevin with the same patient expression she'd perfected during congressional briefings, when senators asked questions that danced dangerously close to classified information. "Kevin, I can't discuss the specifics of ongoing operations or intelligence assessments. What I can tell you is that when international crises develop, the president relies on a small group of advisors to help navigate the situation, and I'm part of that group." The explanation was delivered with the kind of careful precision that revealed nothing while confirming everything. Sarah had learned long ago how to discuss her work in terms that satisfied curiosity without compromising security, but the current situation required a different approach entirely. Amanda had finally recovered enough to speak, though her voice came out tight and controlled in the way that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. "Sarah, this is insane. How long have you been lying to us about what you do? How long have you been pretending to have some boring desk job while you're actually advising the president?" The accusation hung in the air between them, loaded with 20 years of family dinners where Sarah had deflected questions about her work and holidays, where she'd described her responsibilities in the vaguest possible terms. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Amanda's legal mind was clearly working to reconstruct every conversation they'd had about Sarah's career, looking for clues she'd missed or deliberate misdirection she'd fallen for. "I never lied," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the confrontation. "I told you I worked for the government. I told you it involved national security. I told you I couldn't discuss the details because of classification requirements. You chose to interpret that as boring paperwork instead of considering that it might actually be important." The response was delivered without malice, but its accuracy made it sting all the more. Patricia and Amanda had spent years constructing a narrative about Sarah's career that fit their preconceptions about government work and their assumptions about their family's place in the world. The idea that Sarah might actually be more successful and influential than either of them had simply never occurred to them as a possibility. The woman from the helicopter had been monitoring her watch during the family discussion, clearly aware that whatever crisis had triggered Sarah's extraction was continuing to develop while they stood on a country club terrace. "Ms. Chen, I don't want to interrupt, but the timeline is becoming critical." Sarah nodded, understanding that her personal family drama would have to wait while more pressing matters demanded her attention. She turned back to her mother and sister, taking in their shocked expressions, and the crowd of classmates who were still processing what they'd just witnessed. "I have to go," she said simply. "Patricia, Amanda, I know this is a lot to process, and I'm sorry you had to find out this way. We can talk more when the current situation stabilizes." Patricia stepped forward, her maternal instincts finally overriding her social anxiety about the crowd of onlookers. "Sarah, honey, are you safe doing this kind of work? I mean, if you're important enough that they send helicopters to get you?" The question revealed a different side of Patricia, one that transcended the social climbing and status consciousness that usually dominated her interactions with her daughters. For a moment, she sounded like a mother worried about her child rather than a woman concerned about her family's reputation. "I'm as safe as anyone can be in this line of work," Sarah replied, her voice softening slightly. "And I'm good at what I do. Really good. Good enough that the president trusts me to help make decisions that affect millions of people." The admission was delivered without arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her position through competence rather than connections. 20 years of careful work, of building relationships and developing expertise, of proving herself in situations where failure could have catastrophic consequences. Brad had started recording again, apparently unable to resist documenting what was probably the most newsworthy event in Riverside's history. His social media followers were going to get a front-row seat to a real-time family revelation that would be dissected and analyzed by everyone who'd ever known the Chen family. The woman from the helicopter had begun moving toward the stairs that led down to the golf course, subtly indicating that the time for explanations had expired. Sarah fell into step beside her, leaving behind 20 years of family assumptions and reunion small talk for whatever international crisis required her immediate attention. As they walked across the fairway toward Marine One, Sarah could hear the explosion of conversation erupting behind them on the terrace. 300 people were suddenly trying to process the fact that their quiet classmate, the one who'd sat in the back of AP classes and never made a fuss about anything, was apparently one of the most influential people in the country. The helicopter's rotors were already spinning up, creating a wind that whipped across the golf course and sent Sarah's hair streaming behind her. She climbed into the aircraft with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this particular trip dozens of times before, settling into her seat as the Secret Service agents secured the cabin. Through the helicopter's window, she could see the country club growing smaller below them, the terrace still crowded with her former classmates and family members, who were probably going to spend the rest of the evening trying to reconstruct everything they thought they knew about Sarah Chen. As Marine One banked toward Washington, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow, Patricia would have to explain to her friends at the country club exactly what her daughter did for a living. Amanda would have to reconcile her assumptions about Sarah's career with the reality of presidential helicopters and national security briefings. But tonight, Sarah had work to do, and for the first time in 20 years, her family finally understood that her job actually mattered. The seeds of Sarah's exile from her own family had been planted 18 years earlier in the Chen family's formal dining room, among the mahogany furniture and crystal stemware that Patricia had collected as symbols of their ascent into Riverside's upper class. Sarah had been 20 years old, home for winter break from Georgetown University, where she'd been studying international relations with a focus on East Asian politics. She'd spent months preparing for the conversation, rehearsing her arguments and anticipating her parents' objections. But nothing could have prepared her for the violence of their reaction. The family had gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner, a weekly ritual that Patricia treated with the reverence other families reserved for religious services. The table was set with their best china, the conversation carefully steered towards safe topics like Amanda's pre-law studies at Ohio State and the latest expansion plans for Chen's Golden Dragon restaurants. Sarah had waited until dessert was served, hoping that the relaxed atmosphere might soften the blow of what she was about to reveal. "I've been thinking about my career path after graduation," she'd begun, her voice carefully neutral as she tested the waters. "I know we've talked about law school, or maybe an MBA, but I've been exploring some other options." Robert Chen, her father, had looked up from his coffee with the kind of mild interest he typically showed when his daughters discussed their academic pursuits. He'd built his restaurant empire through careful planning and conservative decision-making, and he expected his children to approach their careers with the same methodical strategy that had made the Chen family wealthy. "Other options?" Patricia had asked, her voice carrying just a hint of concern. She'd spent 20 years orchestrating her family's rise in Riverside society, and she had very specific ideas about the kinds of careers that were appropriate for Chen daughters. Sarah had taken a deep breath, knowing that the next few words would fundamentally alter her relationship with her family. "I want to join the Foreign Service. I've been talking to recruiters, and I think I have a real chance of being accepted into the diplomatic corps after graduation." The silence that followed had been deafening. Robert had set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his face cycling through confusion, disappointment, and something that looked dangerously close to anger. Patricia had gone completely still, her social smile frozen in place, as she processed the implications of her daughter's announcement. Amanda, who'd been half-heartedly pushing tiramisu around her plate, had looked up with the kind of incredulous expression usually reserved for particularly offensive jokes. The Foreign Service? Sarah, that's not a real career. That's what people do when they can't get into law school or business school. The dismissal had stung, but Sarah had pressed forward, driven by months of research and genuine excitement about the possibility of serving her country in a meaningful way. Amanda, it's actually an incredibly competitive field. Foreign service officers shape American policy around the world. They negotiate treaties, manage crises, protect American interests in hostile environments. Robert had finally found his voice, though it came out cold and controlled in a way that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure. Sarah, we didn't sacrifice everything to build this family's reputation so you could throw it away on some government job that pays $30,000 a year. The words had hit like physical blows, but Sarah had continued her prepared presentation, explaining the rigorous selection process, the opportunities for advancement, the chance to make a real difference in international affairs. She'd talked about her professor's encouragement, her internship at the State Department the previous summer, her growing passion for understanding the complex web of relationships that shaped global politics. Patricia had listened to the entire explanation with the kind of patient attention she usually reserved for particularly tedious charity committee meetings, her expression growing colder with each word. When Sarah finally finished, Patricia had set down her napkin with the careful precision of someone preparing to deliver a verdict. Absolutely not, she'd said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions for her family and expecting immediate compliance. Sarah, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this idea is completely inappropriate for someone in your position. The phrase, your position, had been loaded with meaning, encompassing not just Sarah's role as the younger Chen daughter, but her family's carefully constructed place in Riverside's social hierarchy. Patricia had worked too hard to establish their reputation among the town's elite to watch one of her daughters throw it away on what she viewed as an essentially working-class career. Sarah had tried to explain that modern diplomacy was far from working class, that foreign service officers often came from prestigious backgrounds and wielded significant influence in international affairs. She'd mentioned the ambassadors she'd met during her internship, their sophisticated understanding of global politics, their ability to shape policy at the highest levels of government. Robert had cut her off mid-sentence, his voice rising with the kind of controlled fury that Sarah had rarely seen from her usually measured father. Enough. You're going to finish your degree at Georgetown, apply to law school like we planned, and put this ridiculous notion out of your head completely. The command had been delivered with the expectation of immediate obedience, but something in Sarah's expression must have suggested that compliance wasn't guaranteed. Robert's face had darkened further as he recognized the stubborn determination that Sarah had inherited directly from him. Sarah, he'd continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, if you pursue this path, if you embarrass this family by taking some clerk position in the State Department, don't expect our support. Financial or otherwise. Patricia had nodded her agreement, her expression suggesting that she viewed Sarah's career aspirations as a personal betrayal rather than a legitimate choice. Honey, we've invested so much in your education, in preparing you for success. Why would you want to waste that on a job where you'll never be important, never be respected, never be anything more than a government employee? The dismissal had been particularly painful because it revealed how little her parents understood about the work that genuinely excited her. They'd reduced her dreams to a caricature based on their own limited understanding of government service, unable to imagine that their daughter might actually be suited for something they couldn't comprehend. Amanda had seized the opportunity to cement her position as the responsible daughter, aligning herself firmly with their parents' perspective. Sarah, I think Mom and Dad are right. You're being impractical. Government work is for people who can't succeed in the private sector. You're smart enough for law school, for a real career that actually matters. The conversation had continued for another hour, with Sarah attempting to defend her choice while her family systematically dismantled every argument she presented. They'd questioned her judgment, her maturity, her understanding of what constituted appropriate career choices for someone of their social standing. When Sarah had finally excused herself from the table, she'd retreated to her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the academic awards and honor society certificates that had once made her parents proud. She'd stared at her Georgetown acceptance letter, framed on the wall beside her high school valedictorian plaque, and realized that all of her achievements meant nothing if they didn't align with her family's narrow definition of success. The next morning, Robert had knocked on her door before sunrise, entering without waiting for permission in the way that parents do when they're preparing to deliver ultimatums. He'd sat on the edge of her bed, his expression softer than it had been the night before, but no less determined. "Sarah, I love you, but I won't watch you destroy your future for some romantic notion about serving your country," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of parental authority and genuine concern. "If you apply to the Foreign Service, if you choose that path over the opportunities we've created for you, then you're choosing to do it without our blessing or our support." The ultimatum had been delivered with the kind of finality that suggested no amount of argument or explanation would change his position. Sarah had looked into her father's eyes and seen a man who genuinely believed he was protecting his daughter from making a catastrophic mistake, but who was completely incapable of understanding that his protection felt like suffocation. "Dad," she'd said quietly, "what if this is what I'm meant to do? What if I'm actually good at it?" Robert had stood up, straightening his tie with the same methodical precision he brought to everything in his life. "Then you'll have to be good at it without being my daughter." The words had hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Sarah had understood that her father wasn't speaking metaphorically, that he was prepared to sever their relationship entirely rather than accept her career choice. That afternoon, she'd called the Foreign Service recruiter who'd been courting her since her internship, accepting a position in the entry-level program that would begin after her graduation from Georgetown. She'd also called her academic advisor to discuss the accelerated course schedule that would allow her to graduate a semester early, minimizing the time she'd have to spend navigating her family's disappointment. The decision had felt both liberating and devastating, like jumping off a cliff while simultaneously cutting the rope that might have pulled her back to safety. But as she'd hung up the phone, Sarah had felt something she'd never experienced before in her parents' house: the quiet satisfaction of choosing her own path, regardless of the consequences. The estrangement that followed Sarah's career announcement had unfolded with the slow, inexorable precision of a surgical procedure. Robert Chen had kept his word with the methodical thoroughness that characterized every aspect of his business dealings, systematically removing his younger daughter from the family narrative, as if she were a failed investment that needed to be written off for tax purposes. Sarah's name had disappeared from holiday cards, her photo had been quietly relocated from the prominent positions in the family home to a single frame tucked away in Patricia's bedroom, and her place at the dining room table had been filled by an antique vase that Patricia claimed had always belonged there. The exclusion had been so complete that Sarah sometimes wondered if she'd imagined the first 20 years of her life, if the memories of family dinners and birthday celebrations were elaborate fantasies she'd constructed to fill the void where her childhood should have been. Amanda had embraced her role as the sole Chen daughter with enthusiasm, stepping into the space Sarah had vacated, and expanding it to accommodate her own ambitions and their parents' redirected expectations. Georgetown University had become Sarah's sanctuary during those final months before graduation, a place where her professors valued her insights about international relations, and her classmates respected her analytical abilities. She'd thrown herself into her studies with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that academic success was her only remaining connection to a future that made sense. Dr. Elizabeth Harrow, her thesis advisor and a former ambassador to Southeast Asia, had become an unofficial mentor during Sarah's senior year, providing the kind of guidance and encouragement that her family had withdrawn. Dr. Harrow had recognized something in Sarah that reminded her of her own younger self, a combination of intellectual curiosity and practical determination that was well suited to the complexities of international diplomacy. "Sarah, you have the kind of mind that thrives on complexity," Dr. Harrow had told her during one of their weekly meetings, reviewing Sarah's thesis on economic development strategies in post-conflict regions. "Most people want simple answers to complicated questions, But you understand that the world doesn't work that way. That's going to serve you well in the Foreign Service. The encouragement had meant more to Sarah than she'd been able to express, particularly during the weeks when her family's silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Dr. Harrow had helped her navigate the Foreign Service application process, connecting her with current officers who could provide realistic perspectives on what the career actually entailed, and former students who'd successfully made the transition from academic theory to diplomatic practice. Sarah's acceptance into the Foreign Service had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered in a thick envelope that contained not just her assignment letter but a comprehensive orientation package that outlined her first posting to the embassy in Manila. She'd stared at the documents for nearly an hour, processing the reality that her childhood dreams of international service were about to become her adult profession. That evening, she'd called home for the first time in 2 months, hoping that her acceptance into a competitive government program might bridge the gap that had opened between her and her family. Patricia had answered the phone with the kind of cautious politeness she usually reserved for persistent telemarketers, her voice warming slightly when she recognized Sarah's voice but remaining carefully neutral. "Mom, I got into the Foreign Service," Sarah had announced, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice despite the months of family tension. "My first assignment is going to be in the Philippines, working on trade relations and economic development programs." The silence that followed had been longer and more profound than Sarah had expected, stretching out until she'd begun to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Patricia finally responded, her voice had carried the weight of disappointment and resignation, rather than pride or congratulation. "Well, I suppose that's what you wanted," Patricia had said, her tone suggesting that Sarah's achievement was more of a personal failing than a professional success. "I hope you understand that this choice has consequences, Sarah. Your father and I can't support decisions that we fundamentally disagree with." The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes, ending with Patricia's polite but firm suggestion that Sarah should focus on her new career rather than trying to maintain family relationships that had become too complicated to sustain. Sarah had hung up the phone, understanding that her graduation from Georgetown would mark not just the beginning of her professional life, but the formal end of her place in the Chen family hierarchy. Amanda had sent a brief email 3 days later, a message that managed to be both congratulatory and dismissive in the same paragraph. "Congratulations on your government position," she'd written. "I'm sure it will be an interesting experience, though I have to admit I don't understand why you'd choose such an uncertain career path when you had so many better options available." The email had gone on to update Sarah about Amanda's own acceptance to law school and her summer internship at a prestigious Cleveland firm, achievements that would be celebrated with family dinners and proud announcements to everyone in their parents' social circle. The contrast had been deliberate and pointed, a reminder that while Sarah was pursuing her unconventional dreams, Amanda was following the path that led to family approval and financial security. Sarah's graduation ceremony had taken place on a bright May morning, with Dr. Harrow serving as her only family representative in an audience filled with proud parents and excited siblings. The absence of her own family had been painful but not surprising, and Sarah had focused her attention on the future rather than dwelling on the empty seats that should have been occupied by people who'd once claimed to love her unconditionally. The transition from Georgetown to the Foreign Service Institute had been smoother than Sarah had anticipated, helped by the discovery that many of her colleagues had similar stories of family disapproval and career choices that had strained traditional relationships. The intensive training program had provided not just professional preparation, but a community of like-minded individuals who understood the sacrifices required by public service. Her first assignment in Manila had been both challenging and revelatory, introducing her to the complex realities of international diplomacy, while confirming her instinct that she'd chosen the right career path. Sarah had discovered that she possessed a natural talent for understanding cultural nuances and building relationships across language barriers, skills that had quickly earned her recognition from senior embassy staff. The work itself had been more varied and intellectually stimulating than anything she'd experienced in academic settings, requiring her to navigate political tensions while advancing American economic interests in one of Asia's most dynamic markets. Sarah had found herself mediating trade disputes, facilitating business partnerships, and providing policy recommendations that influenced millions of dollars in international commerce. Her first performance evaluation had been overwhelmingly positive, with her supervisor noting her exceptional analytical abilities and her talent for building productive relationships with Filipino government officials and business leaders. The recognition had come with a recommendation for accelerated promotion and consideration for more sensitive assignments that would expand her responsibilities and influence. Meanwhile, back in Riverside, the Chen family had settled into a new equilibrium that excluded Sarah entirely. Patricia had begun telling friends that she had one daughter, Amanda, who was excelling in law school and preparing for a career that would bring honor to the family name. The fiction had been so completely maintained that some of their social circle had forgotten that Sarah had ever existed, treating any mention of her as a reference to a distant relative or family friend, rather than Patricia's younger daughter. Amanda had graduated from law school with honors and joined the Cleveland firm where she'd interned, quickly establishing herself as a rising star in corporate litigation. Her professional success had been celebrated with family gatherings and proud announcements in the local newspaper, achievements that validated Robert and Patricia's confidence in their parenting philosophy and social ambitions. The contrast between Amanda's celebrated career and Sarah's invisible service had become a recurring theme in family conversations, with Patricia regularly updating her friends about Amanda's latest courtroom victories, while remaining completely silent about Sarah's growing influence in international affairs. The selective attention had become so habitual that Patricia had apparently convinced herself that she'd made the right choice in cutting ties with her unconventional daughter. Sarah's career had continued its upward trajectory through a series of increasingly responsible positions that had taken her from Manila to Brussels to Cairo, each assignment building on her growing expertise in international economics and her reputation for diplomatic effectiveness. She'd negotiated trade agreements, managed crisis communications during regional conflicts, and provided policy analysis that had shaped American responses to emerging global challenges. The work had been demanding and often dangerous, requiring long hours in high-pressure environments where mistakes could have serious consequences for American interests and international relationships. Sarah had thrived in these conditions, discovering that she possessed both the intellectual capacity and emotional resilience required for senior diplomatic responsibilities. Her promotion to the National Security Council had marked a significant milestone in her career, recognizing her expertise in Asian affairs and her proven ability to provide strategic analysis during complex international situations. The position had brought her into regular contact with senior government officials and foreign dignitaries, expanding her influence beyond traditional diplomatic channels. By the time Sarah had been appointed Deputy National Security Advisor, she'd become one of the most respected voices in American foreign policy, consulted regularly by cabinet members and congressional leaders on issues ranging from trade negotiations to military interventions. Her analysis and recommendations had influenced decisions that affected millions of people around the world, yet her own family remained completely unaware of her professional achievements. The irony hadn't been lost on Sarah that she'd become more influential than anyone in her family had ever imagined possible, while simultaneously remaining invisible to the people who'd once claimed to know her best. She'd learned to live with the contradiction, building a professional life that provided the recognition and respect that her personal life had failed to deliver. Her colleagues in the national security community had become her chosen family, relationships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to public service rather than blood ties and social expectations. Admiral Marcus Thompson, her mentor and predecessor as Deputy National Security Advisor, had provided the kind of paternal guidance that Robert Chen had withdrawn, recognizing Sarah's potential and nurturing her development as a strategic thinker and policy advisor. Thompson had been the one to recommend Sarah for her current position, writing in his evaluation that she possessed an exceptional combination of analytical brilliance and diplomatic insight that makes her uniquely qualified to advise the president during international crises. The recommendation had carried particular weight given Thompson's own distinguished career and his reputation for mentoring the next generation of national security professionals. The president's confidence in Sarah's abilities had been demonstrated repeatedly during her tenure as Deputy National Security Advisor, with her analysis and recommendations shaping American responses to everything from trade disputes with China to military actions in the Middle East. She'd participated in crisis meetings that had determined the fate of nations, provided briefings that had influenced trillion-dollar economic policies, and negotiated agreements that had prevented international conflicts. Yet despite these professional achievements, or perhaps because of them, the gap between Sarah and her family had only widened over the years. Patricia and Amanda had constructed their own version of success that left no room for Sarah's unconventional career. Dismissing government service as inherently less valuable than private sector accomplishments, regardless of the actual scope or influence involved. The evening of the class reunion had represented a collision between these two separate worlds, forcing Sarah's family to confront the reality of her professional achievements in the most public and undeniable way possible. The arrival of Marine One at their high school reunion had shattered every assumption they'd made about her career and her importance, replacing their comfortable fiction with an uncomfortable truth. As Marine One approached the White House helipad, Sarah could see the familiar lights of the Situation Room, where she'd spent countless hours analyzing intelligence reports and preparing policy recommendations. The helicopter's landing would mark the beginning of another crisis management session, another opportunity to apply her expertise to challenges that would test American leadership and international relationships. But for the first time in 18 years, Sarah was returning to work with the knowledge that her family finally understood what she actually did for a living. They might not approve of her choices, they might not welcome her back into their carefully constructed social world, but they could no longer dismiss her career as unimportant, or pretend that her work didn't matter. The helicopter's rotors began to slow as they settled onto the White House grounds, and Sarah prepared herself for whatever international crisis had interrupted her reunion. But she also allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that tomorrow morning, Patricia Chen would have to explain to her friends at the country club exactly why the president's helicopter had landed at her daughter's high school reunion. The irony was perfect. After 18 years of being erased from her family's narrative, Sarah had finally become impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and impossible to pretend didn't exist. The quiet girl who'd been written off for choosing government service had become one of the most influential people in the country, and her family's assumptions about success and importance had been shattered in the most public way imaginable. As Sarah walked across the White House lawn toward the West Wing, she carried with her not just the weight of whatever international crisis awaited her attention, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she'd proven everyone wrong who'd ever doubted her choices or dismissed her dreams. The girl who'd been rejected for wanting to serve her country had become indispensable to the people who actually ran it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.